let me just underline the importance to everybody listening or watching of consistent effort of any scale. Yeah.
Mm,
If you've got 5 minutes a day to do something, sure, it doesn't look like much after one day, but 5 minutes a day in a week, you're already getting to past half an hour. Yeah. So in 2 weeks, it's an
yeah.
hour. In a month, it's 2 hours. If it adds up little by little, eventually, over the course of, say, a year of doing something, you'll find that you've got enough to have actually completed something. It's the same for people who say that they don't have time for reading. Everybody's got time for reading.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stolaroid Stories. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the YouTube channel. Today, I'm talking with Christopher Walker. Chris Walker. Chris is a writer. He's published 20 books. He's the editor of the IH Journal, the International House Journal. He's an avid reader. He's a native speaker of English, and he's also an English teacher. He will tell us a lot about writing, about reading, about what it means to be a great writer. We talked about language exams. We talked about the difference between fiction and non-fiction. This is one of the most interesting conversations I've ever had on the channel, probably because I'm very interested in these topics: reading and writing, creativity, English as a second language. So I hope that you will enjoy it as much as I have. Get ready now. It's story time. Welcome, Chris. Welcome to Stolaroid Stories. It's a pleasure to have you here on my show today. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Fabio.
So, Chris, I've invited you today to talk about mainly writing, because you're a writer, right? So you're a
Yes.
writer, and you've written something like 20 books. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've actually kind of lost track. I've
Wow.
I've written a lot of different things. Some of them have been fiction, some non-fiction, some teaching related, um, and I think I stopped keeping track after the first couple.
Okay. Well, that's a problem that I would love to have, losing track of the books that I've written. I've only written one, so I don't have
Ah,
that
but it was a
problem
good
now.
start.
Yeah, yeah, and you reviewed that book too, so thank you for your generous review too. Um, so why why do you write? This is my first question. What makes you interested in writing?
There are lots of reasons that people give for writing. Sometimes they say that they really have a story inside them that they want to get out. And I suppose to an extent that's true for me. I think that when you spend a lot of time doing something and it gives you a lot of pleasure, you start to want to do other things connected as well. So it's a little bit like there are people who watch football a lot. And because they watch football a lot, they dream of being a player. So they'll start
Mm,
having a kick around with their kids, they'll go to the park, whatever. And I think it's the same when you're a passionate reader like I am. Like my office is full of books, my home is full of books. And when you surround yourself with books, you start to wish that you had one of your own on the shelf with your name on, something like that. And you start to look for opportunities for writing stories. And for me, the opportunities come about either because I want to entertain my children, which is really why I've written the young adult stories that I've written, such as The Four Queens, which is my latest effort. But also, when you're reading books, the author of those books will always take a particular path and they will ignore or avoid the other paths that could have been taken. So, as the characters in the story you're reading are developing, as the plot develops, you find that there are those possible branching out points. And you start to think, well, what if that had happened instead of this? And that's really the start for a lot of story ideas. You read something, you think, well, the story was this, but it could have been that. maybe I could write that story. So you start to look
Mm.
into doing it that way.
Okay, so you started as a reader.
Yes.
So you started your interest comes from your interest in writing comes from reading. Okay,
Yes.
and you read mainly fiction. Is that correct?
I do. I try to get a nicely balanced and varied diet. I try to make sure that I read some non-fiction. Non-fiction, frankly, is easier for me to take into the classroom. And I don't mean the book itself. Often the book would be a little bit too difficult for my students to read. But the ideas that the book contains, those are things that I can take into the classroom and I can discuss with my students. So I do like reading non-fiction, but I find that fiction itself is often a more rewarding experience. It's something that draws me in a little bit more. And I had a very nice analogy recently. I think I read it on Twitter or somewhere, where they said that nonfiction is very good at populating your head with ideas, but fiction is what expands the landscape on which those ideas can be populated. And I quite like that, really, because it gives you a good reason to want to read fiction. And truth be told, amongst men generally, non-fiction generally holds sway more than fiction does. And I think that it's good for people of every gender to read everything that's available. So if you're reading non-fiction, that's great. If you're reading fiction, that's great. If somehow you're able to read poetry, and frankly, I'm not, I don't quite get it enough. But if you can, that too is great. All reading is great, basically.
And how do you think? Because I don't read fiction. Um, I read, I would say, maybe 10 books, 10 fiction books, but I read nonfiction. And in your opinion, in your experience, uh, how do you think fiction expands your thinking? Have you noticed this in your experience?
Yes, so the idea of non-fiction is that you're being presented with things that are, to an extent, uncontestable. So the person who has written a piece of nonfiction has done their research. They found out everything that it is objectively possible to know and put into that book, but they have to leave a lot of subjectivity to one side. So, for example, if you're reading a biography of a person, you will learn about the actions that that person took. You will learn about the justifications that they gave, but a good biographer will try to keep their own opinions out of it and they won't say what was really going on. So if you've got somebody who lived a very guarded life and was very careful about what they put out into the world, you're not going to get much insight into the processes or the thinking of that person. Fiction, on the other hand, can give you insight. So I suppose a classic example would be about a couple of years ago, I read an excellent biography of an old English writer called Somerset Maugham. It's one of my favorite writers of all time. He wrote The Razor's Edge, which was turned into a movie with Bill Murray back in, I think, the 1980s. Fantastic movie, actually. He wrote of human bondage. He wrote some of the short stories that I've fallen in love with over the years. The biography was excellent. It told the story of his life, all of his relationships, some of the things that he experienced that got him into writing in the first place, the tragedies of his life, things like that. But it didn't really give you much inside his head because, of course, the biographer, Selina Hastings, wasn't able to access the inside of his head. More recently, I read a book by Anthony Burgess, who's famous for The Clockwork Orange, and his book was called Earthly Powers. And he essentially wrote a kind of, well, it starts off as like, you can see the parallels. Like the main character in Earthly Powers is clearly modeled on Somerset Maugham. It's not Somerset Maugham, but it's clearly modeled on him. And because it's a creative effort, you get that insight. You get to see what was making that sort of person tick. Now, of course, it's only one writer's opinion, but when you've got somebody as amazing as Anthony Burgess guiding the way, you start to think, actually, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The things that happen, the way that he responds, the way that he thinks about responding, the responses that the character wanted to make but failed to make because of weakness or inability. These are all things that you can't get in nonfiction because nonfiction deals with the world as it is. Fiction, I suppose, deals with the world as it could be or might have been.
Hmm. And how do you where do you find your ideas for books? Because you've written 20 books, yeah. Well, you lost track. We said it before, but
Yeah, yeah.
where do you find your ideas? Just from your readings, like from the fiction books that you read, or from somewhere else?
Well, again, this is one of those great things about reading is that you come across so many things that you didn't plan to come across. There are so many kind of serendipitous moments. So I'll give you one example of a kind of genesis moment. I think it was in a book called The Pillars of Hercules by Paul Theroux. And it was when he was in Gibraltar, and you've got the Rock of Gibraltar, which is known as one of the Pillars of Hercules. And he could see on a clear day across to Ceuta on the Moroccan side. And he thought, on a good day, a ferry could take you from one side to the other pretty quickly. It takes like an hour or something, depending on the conditions. But he thought, well, what if you went the other way?
Hmm.
What if you went from one rock to the other without
Hmm.
going across the water? You just followed the land. So he did that. He spent about a year traveling. And as he was traveling, he went through Venice. And briefly, he mentioned this old tradition called the Wedding of the Sea, where the Duke or whoever it was in Venice, tradition has it, would take a wedding ring, and every year he'd go out in his big ship into the lagoon and he would throw the wedding ring into the sea, and it was the job of a local to retrieve it, something like that. It was an old tradition. And it
Hmm.
took up less than a paragraph in the Paul Theroux book, and I couldn't find much mention of it elsewhere. But I started thinking, wouldn't that make for an interesting story? The Wedding of the
Hmm.
Sea. And you'll notice if you look on Amazon, one of my collections of short stories, and I've put a few collections out there, is called The Wedding of the Sea and Other Stories. And I actually think it's one of my most successful short stories. It's one that I'm most pleased with because it looks at it from a couple of different aspects. There's a young guy who's learning how to dive, obviously without oxygen because the story takes place a couple of hundred years in the past. He's learning how to dive because he's training to be the person who retrieves the wedding ring from the sea in Venice. And then it switches viewpoint to the preparations leading up to the big festival and all of that. There are all these little interplays. The Doge, I think it would have been in Venice, is getting old and he's losing his memory, and it becomes quite critical, this factor of his loss of the memory, because when he comes to throw the wedding ring in to the lagoon, he gets distracted and he suddenly looks at his hand. He's like, "Did I throw it? Have I done it yet?" So there are all these question marks about what happens, and the story itself it kind of presented itself very readily. If you get the right ingredients together, I suppose it's a bit like cooking. If you're in a kitchen and you don't know what to cook, but you look and you can see the ingredients in front of you, you can pretty quickly come up with quite a nice meal. If you've had practice cooking, of course.
Yeah. Um, I guess this process is much more difficult than writing nonfiction because you have to, like, you have nothing to work on. I mean, if you write nonfiction and you're writing your own stories, well, that's easy. That's what I did. Yeah, my first and last book was this, my own
Yeah.
stories, and it was, in a way, I think it's much easier than writing a story that doesn't exist. Like you have to invent everything, right?
You
So
do,
it
but I
takes a
think a
lot
lot
of.
of
Mm,
writers, yeah, but I think a lot of writers draw on personal experience, don't they? So another
mm,
collection of stories that I put out was called Sarah the Writer, and these are all stories that are set in Poland, and some of them draw very heavily on real experience. So one of them is basically a day in the life of an English teacher. So it starts early in the morning, it takes you through the whole day, all these lessons, and to the end of the day, coming home. So it's not really a plot driven story, it's more like an extended vignette, you could say. Um, a bit like, one of the most famous novels is a day in the life of Alexander Denisovich. I think something like that, isn't it? Solzhenitsyn wrote it, and it was a day in the life of a prisoner in a gulag in Siberia. So there's not like a
mm.
plot. There's not much that's changed by the end of the day that wasn't true at the start of the day, and it's the same with this. And I'm not trying to draw any parallels, by the way, between teaching English and being a prisoner in the gulag. There are several differences that I can think of just off the top of my head, but that form the basis of the story. So, in some senses, you could say that the story was just real life with the names of the characters changed to protect the identities of the innocent. But there is also that element of the insight. So, if somebody were to observe me teaching, going through the whole day, their
Mm,
piece of non-fiction would look very different to the story that I wrote, because the story I
mm.
wrote had that person as a character, sharing their thoughts and their feelings about what they were doing.
I see. And how do you um, like? What's your process? What does your writing process um, look like? So you have an idea and then you make notes. So how can you take us through the process of starting and finishing one of your books? Maybe what your favorite book that you've written?
My favorite book is probably the most recent one, because it's the one that I've had the most positive feedback about. And when I say positive feedback, I mean that my daughters love it. And that means a
Oh,
lot to me
nice.
because I want to please them. It's my target audience. They're my children. I want them to read my books as they get older. And so it's really nice that they've got this book that they can read now, because it is kind of aimed at more or less who they are and where they are in life. So
Nice.
the 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 key moment was the germination of the story, and it was this idea that if you're I don't know if it was because of the death of Queen Elizabeth that kind of led into this, and the possibility of there being a new king, a new queen, that sort of thing. But I don't know, I think it was one of those things where I had the idea in the back of my mind, and I'd been carrying it for several years, of what would happen if you were an attractive young girl living in a kind of late medieval sort of kingdom, and a prince wanted to marry you, or the king wanted to marry you because you're so pretty, and you're just not interested. You're like, the whole royal life doesn't appeal. I don't really want to have to put up with this selfish king. I'd much rather, for example, spend my time reading. That would be my ideal world. I just want to read. I don't want to get married to some king and to just be like standing on the balcony waving to the peasantry. I want to go and sit in the library and read a book. But if you kind of got trapped in that situation where there was no escape, because for some reason you're the most beautiful woman in the whole country, and of course the king has to marry you, how would you get out of it? you
Hmm.
know how could people get out of it? And I thought, that's a nice story, but what would be even nicer would be if there were four girls who had exactly the same situation, and each of them, and then I thought, wait, they can't all love reading, so maybe each of them has their own passion. So it was basically, you start with an idea and you take it out in different directions and you see what works and what makes sense. Essentially, I'm looking for the path of least resistance. I'm looking for the story that's going to be the easiest to tell. And as I start thinking about the story and how it can develop, I start to think about the problems that it presents. And essentially, what I end up with is between the start and that first moment and finishing the book, I'm presenting myself with a series of problems. And the resolution of each of those problems will feed into the story until I feel that I've solved all of the problems and the story is then complete.
And how do you know if it works or not?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. Um, One of the things that I do, as well as working as a teacher and writing, is I do a lot of proofreading. And one of the reasons
Mm.
that people end up sending me their work to proofread or to edit is because they've spent so much time looking at it that they can no longer see it. And
Mm.
it's like that classic poster that I've seen, this picture going round and around, where there's like a quote or something, and it's got the at the end of one line and the at the start of the next, and you don't see it. You read it. If somebody says, read this to me, you don't say the. Your brain deletes one of the extra words because it's already seen it and it just kind of goes into the next thing. So after some time, you do become blind to the things that you've written. You've filled in the gaps mentally, but another person might not have seen them. So, in the ideal world, when you've written something, you need to give it to somebody who can look at it with fresh eyes. And that's,
Yeah.
from their feedback, you'll start to know if you've finished it. Because they might come to you and say, okay, but I don't understand why this character did this thing. Can you explain that to me? And if you need to explain it outside of the context of the story, it means that you haven't explained it well enough in the story. Now, I know that most people don't have a person like that in their lives that they can give their writing to, and frankly, I don't. But actually, we all do have somebody like that, and it's us. Now, the
Hmm.
way that you do it is that you finish writing your story, maybe you edit it, you polish it, you give it some shape, and you say, okay, I think it's about finished. You save it or you print it off, whatever you want to do. And then you try not to come back to it for at least a month,
A
preferably
month?
2, 3, or 4 months. Don't come back to it until then.
Ooh.
Because what you want to happen is for your brain to kind of reset a little bit, for you to forget the things that you wrote. And then when you come back to it, it's the new you that comes back to it. It's you plus 2 or 3 months. And when you come back to
Ooh.
it after that time, you do have freshness. You have those fresh eyes. The first full novel that I wrote was called Hit the Bottom and Escape. And it was this idea of two guys traveling through parts of Africa, trying to experience Africa, trying to make sense of who they were, why they were there, what it was like to be in that part of Africa. Um, and to be honest, I wrote it in a month. I was dating my girlfriend who then became my wife, and she would come round to watch like Poland's Got Talent or something, which I hated. So I'd put the headphones on and I was typing away, and I did the whole thing, 50,000 words in about a month, and I saved it, and then I forgot about it. I just put it away, and I did not come back to that story for a year. It was 12 months before I came back to it. And when I came back to it, I hated it because I
Hmm.
was reading it thinking, oh
Hmm.
my goodness, I wrote this. This is just terrible. Like the characters are not fully formed. The descriptions are really dull. There's no kind of wit. There's no energy. So I then spent close to a year rewriting it, taking what I could of the original, reworking it because I liked the story. I just didn't like the writing. And at the end of that second year, again, I put it away, this time not for another 12 months, but just for a couple of months because I was busy with work at the time. And when I came back to it, suddenly the story seemed to make a lot more sense. The characters seemed to work. Some of the additions that I'd made were successful. And yeah, I was pleased with it. So then I self published it through Amazon. got some copies for myself, started giving them to people that I thought would actually read it. And it was quite incredible what the results were, because two teachers at the school here were kind enough to read it. One of them has been a fan and a supporter ever since. Well, maybe fan is too big a word, but she has been a supporter, which is very kind of her. It's a woman called Christine who worked with us here. So she read it and she said it was hilarious. She liked all of the dry humor, the black humor in the story, but she loved the story. She thought it was a really entertaining read. Another teacher read it and came back to me kind of almost shaking and said, "Oh God, it's so dark and depressing. Oh, I don't think I ever want to do that myself. I'm never going to go to that part of the world." And I was like, wait, this was the same book that the other person read. One person thought it was a comedy. The other one thought that it was dark and depressing. It's the same book. So you can never know how your stories are going to reach other people, because they're going to bring themselves to the story and to their reading, and their conclusions about it are going to be wildly variant.
And do you think it's a brilliant story? Now I think now I'm warming up to fiction because of you. I now want to read this book. I'll put it in the show notes. What's the title again?
That one about Africa was called "Hit the
Yeah,
Bottom and Escaped."
hit the bottom.
And escape.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, do you think that the writer should care about reviews, like the reviews that he or she gets? I mean, do you read the reviews that people leave on your books?
I do everything I can to get reviews. Reviews are the lifeblood of writers like me, because I'm not a known entity. I mean, if you go onto Amazon and you're looking for a book to read, you're probably not going to read a book that has no reviews and no ratings, because you might even start thinking, well, maybe this is just AI generated and it didn't cost the writer any time to do. And it's basically a trick to get you to download it or to read it through Kindle Unlimited. And they're just trying to make a bit of passive income through the page turns.
There are many these days.
It happens quite a lot. It happens a lot. I mean, there are thousands of books appearing daily on Amazon, because there's no barrier to entry. You have something and it goes there, and it's basically just set up so that people will get the book through Kindle Unlimited, and they'll do page turns. And I think there's almost an industry, like a cottage industry for this. Like one guy will do this, and then you'll have like almost farms of people in India and China who have like Amazon, the Kindle Unlimited subscription, and basically you set the price of the book as high as you can, so that the people doing the page turns will complete the book, and Amazon will then give those authors a slice of the pie. So whatever money has gone into Kindle Unlimited, those authors will get it. And that's why you find these awful books that seem to have no value, but they're being sold for like €10 for the Kindle version. Nobody's going to buy it for €10, but if somebody reads the book through Kindle Unlimited, that's the equivalent of a €10 sale. So that's kind of how it works. Now, I'm not interested in that. I write for myself, first of all. I write for the pleasure of writing, and for the hope that in the future, people who know me and who are close to me will read those books and kind of remember me. So it's almost like a legacy. And that's one of the reasons why pretty much everything that I sell through Amazon is priced as low as possible. Like I'm selling most of my books for about €1 on the Kindle. I'm not going to get rich from it, but that doesn't matter. I do read the reviews. And for the Four Queens, the most recent one, I actually paid quite a bit of money to get independent assessment of my book. And the reviews came back, the ratings came back, and they're all very high. And it was quite moving to me, because these people don't know me. They have no reason to be generous with their opinions. So when somebody that you don't know says that the book was really moving or they loved it, it really makes your day. It's great to hear it from
Yeah.
friends, of course. If a friend says, "Oh, I like that story, it was good," or they talk
Yeah, of
about
course.
it, I love that. That's fantastic. But when somebody you don't know reads and appreciates your work, it really means a lot. But it also means that you did a good job of telling the story that you had in your mind. Because there's always a difference between what's in here and what somebody else will put into their heads based on your words. The two are not the same. And I mean, this is the classic conundrum of communication, isn't it? This is why language teachers exist, but language teachers need cultural training as much as anything else, because when I say something, um, my classic example is if I say to my students, somebody comes into the room and they say, "Wow, it's hot in here." What does that person mean? And the students say, "Well, they mean it's hot." I say, "Ah, do they?" They might not. It could be they go into the room and they notice the smell.
Hmm.
But they can't say, "Wow, it smells in here." They'll say, "Wow, it's hot in here," because they want you to open the window. And the window opening is the whole goal of that piece of communication. But the meaning is not exactly the same as you might imagine it to be. Now, imagine that, but on the scale of a book. So when you're reading a book, especially with literature, the author had an idea and they expressed that idea through literary devices, but whether or not the idea will be received by the reader is a big question, and whether or not they'll receive it in anything like the same way, that is another question.
Well said. Love it. And also, I want to ask you if you think no, where do you find the time to write those books?
Well,
Because
that's a very good question.
20 books, I guess, they take a lot of time. And you're a
I would say,
full-time worker, I imagine. So you have kids.
let me just underline the importance to everybody listening or watching of consistent effort of any scale. Yeah.
Mm,
If you've got 5 minutes a day to do something, sure, it doesn't look like much after one day, but 5 minutes a day in a week, you're already getting to past half an hour. Yeah. So in 2 weeks, it's an
yeah.
hour. In a month, it's 2 hours. If it adds up little by little, eventually, over the course of, say, a year of doing something, you'll find that you've got enough to have actually completed something. It's the same for people who say that they don't have time for reading. Everybody's got time for reading. I take my Kindle with me when I take my children to school on the bus in the morning. And our bus leaves close to our home at 7:10, and it gets close to the school that they go to at about 7:40. So that gives me half an hour. And I look around the bus sometimes and I see all these people on their phones, and I think, well, okay, they're on their phones. What are they doing? Is it useful or is it just to kill the time? But for at least 20 of those 30 minutes, I have my Kindle out, I'm reading something. And you know what? I
That's
started
it.
a book. Yeah, I started a book on the Kindle at the start of the year, and I only read that book when I'm on the bus going to school. I've nearly finished it. It's like 400 pages. It's actually non-fiction, ironically, but it's about 400 pages long. And there you go, just 20 minutes. I mean, it's 5 times a week. It's not even seven because it's only school 5 times a week. But instead of just spending my time on Instagram or looking at other forms of social media or looking at memes or anything else, I spend those 20 minutes or so looking at my Kindle reading, and it adds up. If you do it once, you're going to think, well, that was pointless. I've hardly read anything. I've read 3 pages. Sure, 3 pages the first day. By the end of the week, you're 20, 25 pages into something. 10 weeks later, you've finished the whole book.
And how does that
And it's the
apply to
same. It's the
writing?
same with writing. Well, it's the same with writing. You don't need to have like a 5 hour chunk of time to sit down and write. And in fact, you don't really want that, because as you start getting further into it, I mean, there's a golden target. And if I find that I'm writing more than 2,000 words in a sitting, I kind of make myself stop, even if I feel like I could continue, because after 2000 you start to run out of freshness, and if you let yourself continue, you will start to notice that you're getting a bit stale. You're using the same sentence structures, you're using the same kind of vocabulary. It gets repetitive. So it is good to force yourself to have a limit. But even if I've only got time to write 100 words or 200 words of a story, if I've got the story there and I can just get a little bit of it down, it still means that within a week or two, I'll have a story. It won't be a book, but it will be a short story. And that's something. And you're just keeping your hand in. You're just making sure that you don't lose the skills that you've spent so much time developing as a writer. You keep going. And it's that consistency that's so important. I mean, any writer will tell you the same. If you want to be a writer, you need to write a bit every day, or at least read books every day. You always need to be doing it, but you don't have to do it a lot. You just do a little bit every day, and it makes a difference.
This reminds me of something I read in a nonfiction book called Someday is Today. Let me grab it.
Mm-hmm.
It's this one. 22 simple, actionable ways to propel your creative life. And the author, by Matthew Dix. And the author says what you're saying here. So he's a novelist. He's an international best-selling novelist. He says, those people who come to me saying that they need to be secluded in a cabin onto the mountains to write a book, that doesn't make sense. Because if I have 10 minutes or even 5 minutes, that chunk of time is enough for me I will try to write in that chunk of time 4 or 5 good sentences, or maybe edit a couple of sentences that I wrote before. And that's how he writes books. He blogs every day, so you will find a blog post every day on his blog. Sometimes 100 words, sometimes 600. You never know, but it's exactly what you're saying here. So you don't need to have an hour of time. And this is something that I used to think. I used to be like that. Like, if I don't have at least 1 hour for a book, well, I won't start, because what's the point?
Yeah. Well, this is that expression, isn't it? Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Oh, gosh, it's in this book too. Have you read this book?
Yeah. I haven't, no, but it's funny, isn't it? That the same ideas are in circulation like that. It reminds me a little bit. I'll give you 2 more little anecdotes. The first one is an example of this at work. Now, I've already mentioned this story, but in Sarah the Writer, I had that day in the life of an English teacher. Now, I actually wrote that bit by bit because I was working at a university in another town. And I always got there because, the buses take you when the buses take you. You don't get to choose if you're not a driver. So I would always get to the university and be set up ready to teach at least half an hour before the first students arrived. Now, I could have spent that time looking at YouTube, just whiling away the time. But instead, I started a draft email to myself, and I would write the start of the story for 20 minutes. And then the following week, I read through what it was, and then I added another for about 20 minutes. And it just built over consecutive weeks. I think of all the short stories I've written, that one probably took me the longest to write because I was only doing it once a week for a number of, I think it must have taken 2 or 3 months. But the other one about this idea of the perfect being the enemy of the good, I remember another teacher at the school here many years ago. And when I said that I liked writing, she said, I've always wanted to be a writer myself. And I said, really? She's like, yes, but I'm still looking for the right typewriter. And I was like, typewriter? What do you mean? She said, well, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it properly. And to do it properly, you need a proper typewriter, like Hemingway used. I was like, I'm sure Hemingway probably wrote ideas for a story on the back of a betting slip when he was at the races in Paris. He certainly wouldn't wait to get home, the typewriter set up, quiet all around him. Oh, it has to be just the right time of day so that I have a beautiful light coming through the window. No, you just write when you're able to write. You don't wait.
Those are excuses, yeah, to hide.
Exactly right. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
you're hiding, aren't you? I would do this if only. It's like, well, make it
No,
happen.
get rid of if only or
Yeah.
when. Um, and you say you're also an editor. You're the
That's
editor of
right.
the IH journal. So what do you do
That's
there? Like
right.
what's the role? What does an editor do?
Well, I can only speak for myself personally, and I think I'm
Yeah.
lucky in a way that my editing position is a little bit different to editing positions at some other outlets. I've sent articles to other places, and sometimes the feedback I get from the editor is, could you please maybe make the sentences a bit shorter and use less of the passive because we need to think about search engine optimization. Yeah. So the editor's work is being driven by how Google
Google.
works. And I
Yeah.
don't, I'm fortunate that that's never been something asked of me. Basically, I know that it takes time, it takes energy, it takes effort, and there is a cost associated with people reading something, especially if it's on the internet and especially if it's work related. I understand that there is a cost to the reader. So my job as the editor is to make sure that anything that goes in front of the reader is worth the cost to them of their time and attention. So if I get a
Mm.
piece and I feel that some of it is right and some of it needs tweaking or trimming or tidying so that the idea goes in a more straightforward way from the writer to the reader, I'll step in as the editor and I'll reassemble things. I'll take out the things that I think are too tangential and don't add enough. I might suggest things to the writer and say, look, this is really interesting. Maybe spend another paragraph looking at it before you move on. So it is a kind of collaborative process. And you could say it's between three parties. It's between me as the editor, the writer, and the target audience, which is, people out there, the teachers of the world who want to read something from the journal. So we're really working together, imagining who the reader is and what they want, and making sure that the writer achieves the goals that they set themselves when they write an article.
And that's all nonfiction, I imagine.
Oh, of course, yes, yeah.
Okay. And I've read the introduction of your nonfiction book. English is a simple language, and your style is, as you were saying before, it's clean, like it's succinct. Which is, would you say that succinct writing is an essential aspect, feature of good writing?
No, but for nonfiction, yes.
Oh, for nonfiction, yes.
And I think here we've got another one of those key differences between fiction and nonfiction. And
Mm,
the idea in nonfiction is that you're trying to communicate something to somebody who doesn't know the thing yet.
mm.
I think that's basically what nonfiction is. I know something, you don't know that thing, I want you to know that thing. And
Or
that's what
maybe,
nonfiction is.
yeah, or maybe I know something, but I want to know more about this, or I want your perspective on this, because those people who read, they read about the same topic, many books about the same topic,
Yes.
like
But
productivity, for example.
they're
Mm,
always looking for something they don't know.
yeah, yeah, that's true.
So it always comes down to that in nonfiction. I know something, you don't know that particular thing. My job is to get that thing into your head so that it sits there and it makes sense, and you can then just take that knowledge on, and it's yours now. With
Yeah.
writing literature, with writing fiction, the goal is not
Mm-hmm.
quite the same because you want the reader to appreciate the quality of the writing as well.
Mm-hmm.
There are very few writers in history who were able to write nonfiction as if it was fiction. So, like with that quality of language, with that turn of phrase. So, an example of the people who could straddle both worlds would be, I don't know, David Foster Wallace. I mean, he was just some of his writing, like Consider the Lobster, is just like mind blowingly good. And it would be just as good if it were fiction. Likewise, his
Okay.
fiction could work as non-fiction.
So
But that's all about. Mhm.
no, no, sorry, go on, sorry.
Well, it's all about the joy of the sentence. It's the joy of language. So if you read a lot of non-fiction, sometimes the writer almost seems scared of language and they try to couch what they're saying in terms of a conversation. So it's the big weakness of the non-fiction book I'm reading at the moment is that the writer introduces a point and then the next sentence begins with the word yes. It's almost as if they told you that sentence and you go like this and they go, yes, I do think da, 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 da. And you think, okay, that's not really writing. That's speaking written down. It's not taking
Huh.
advantage of the nature of the medium. But then you read somebody like, I don't know, Paul Theroux or David Foster Wallace, and their way of writing. Bill Bryson's good with this sort of thing as well, especially with the way he injected humor into his writing. But it would be a way of expression that was unexpected. And yet, looking back at it, you think there's no better way to have said it. Like it's not just plain and direct, but it does the same job as plain and direct writing. So in fiction, you don't always need a good story or a particularly new story. There are only, what is it, 7 stories, somebody said? You know,
Hmm?
boy meets girl. So basically, X meets Y. What happens next? Well, they fall in love, but they don't. Or they do, and there's a problem, something like that. There's a limited number of stories. But you can always address those stories using different language and different forms of expression. You can say something nobody has ever said before, and that becomes then a delight. And you read it and you think, wow, that sentence was incredible. Now, I don't often read nonfiction and look back at a sentence and say, wow, the way they said that was incredible. The idea, maybe. I'll
Mm.
look at it and say, that idea was incredible. But I won't look at it and say, wow, what an amazing sentence. What an amazing paragraph, the way it was built up.
Huh. This is interesting because this happens to me. I wonder if it's because I read more nonfiction than you, or
It's possible.
because
It's possible.
I'm just because I'll send you an article that I wrote it yesterday, and I analyzed a paragraph. It's 8 sentences long, and I analyzed this paragraph from a nonfiction book that I think it encapsulates a lot of aspects of good writing.
Well, I'll give you a
Yeah,
little example. Sorry, I've disappeared for a second. I'm back. This
it's
is a
okay.
book that I spent most of last year reading. It's
Uh
The
huh. Well.
Penguin History of the Second World War. Yeah? Massive book, quite small writing. It took
Mm.
me most of the school year. When I had a gap between lessons, I tried to read 10 pages a day. And even that was a bit of a struggle because you've got like the British case for Munich has to be tested at 2 points. In 1939, when war in fact came, and in 1940, when the crucial battle was fought, and it just goes on like that. And sometimes you just have to get through the detail because it's non-fiction and it's all about detail. You just have to get through it. But what gave me the reason to get through it was the very first paragraph, and I just want to read it to you, and I hope that this doesn't kind of
Yeah.
trigger
Please.
YouTube's like censors or something. And it's the very first page of the book, chapter 1, the background. I'll read this paragraph because I thought it was the perfect paragraph to introduce a book of this length. There are two extreme views about the European origins of the Second World War. One is that it was all Hitler's fault. The other is that it was a war in which Hitler, along with a lot of other people, and for much the same reasons, got involved. Both views stand condemned by their very simplicity. This book supports neither, but it has to start somewhere, and it starts with Hitler and the Nazis. I love it. You've got the variation in sentence length. Like one is that it was all Hitler's fault. And it's such a simple thing. It's almost like you could say it of children. It's like something from a book for children. It was all Hitler's fault. It's so nice because it's so unexpected. You've got a book that's this long where the last 100 pages are the index. Yeah.
Ooh,
and to have such a simple sentence, and then that repetition of start somewhere, it has to start somewhere, and it starts with, and then it tells you. I actually went round showing my students that paragraph. I said, now, I'm going to read this book, but this is the first paragraph. What do you think? And we took some random paragraphs later, and they were dry and sometimes difficult, and you had to kind of pick your way through. But that first paragraph was a model paragraph. This is how you write a paragraph where the idea is clearly communicated, but the means of communication it scintillates, it shines. And I think that's the key difference. In nonfiction, if you can do that from time to time, that's fantastic. But if you can't, it doesn't matter too much. In fiction, if you can't do this, you shouldn't really be writing, well, maybe not fiction, but you shouldn't be writing literature, because it's not literature if you don't have paragraphs that stand out like that in terms of their raw quality and their fascinating juxtaposition of ideas or a clever repetition of a word. It needs something to make it just kind of buzz.
How did you learn how to write literature or fiction? Like, did you do courses, or it just comes from your reading and just writing?
I think a lot of it comes from the reading, but yeah, you can't underestimate the importance of practice. Like I say, the first full novel that I wrote, when I read it again, I just hated it because it didn't have anything that kind of had that zing to it. There was no sentence that stood out and said, hey, this is a good sentence. But when I got into it more and started editing, the sentences started to come together a little bit. Sometimes I find, as a little kind of mental exercise, what helps is if you've got a writer of fiction that you like because of the way they write, and I've got one here, another heavyweight novel, 2666 by Roberto Bolano. Massive book, but I've read it twice. Absolutely love this to pieces. What I do, if I feel like I'm struggling with the quality of my writing, I just open it at random and I start reading. Then I close it and I start writing.
Writing whatever you were writing before.
Whatever I was writing before. But for a few precious seconds, my writing seems infused with this voice. But it's not him. It's me. But it has an effect.
Interesting. Nice.
I suppose it's a little bit like, you see all these kids playing football, yeah? And you know which ones are going to show off occasionally. They're the ones wearing a Barcelona shirt that says Messi on the back. Because they're the ones who are like, I'm not Messi, but for 5 minutes I can be in my imagination. So they'll suddenly switch to using their left foot, even though they're not left-footed. And they'll be like, hey, Messi, something like that. I think the same goes with writing. If you're struggling, you can't see the way to a good sentence or a good paragraph, just read something again that you like by somebody you like, and you just get kind of infected a little bit. You can take it in and you can start to sound like that just briefly. It's not plagiarism because you're not copying. You're just getting that sense of it.
Yeah, there's another exercise that I read in a book called 100 Ways to Improve Your Writing. it's a nonfiction book, of course, by Gary Provost, and it says from time to time, copy a paragraph from one of your favorite writers. So by copying, like just copying, you get to notice the decisions that the writer made, why you've got this word and not that word. So you start
Yeah.
kind of connecting with the mind of the writer and the decision making process that maybe they went through.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is what I did with my article that I published it yesterday. I want you to read that article, and tell me what you think. But your book, not your book. Well, I think we've got time to talk about your book. English is a simple language,
Yeah, let's
because we're
do.
talking about language here. So English is a simple language. What do you mean? So that's a non-fiction book that you wrote. And what do you mean by English is a simple language? Because to a learner of English might be, well, no, it's not.
Yeah, so the book was born of, well, it was a long, long process, a very kind of evolutionary rather than revolutionary process. And it started with doing an IH course called the Language Awareness course by Alex Tilbury. And then I read The English Verb by Michael Lewis,
Lewis.
which also had
Yeah, read that
a
too.
big effect on me. Yeah, brilliant book.
Yeah.
And the more I thought about it, the more I got into things, especially with grammar, and the more frustrated I got with course book treatments of grammar, the more I thought that it's just too complicated in course books. They take something like the present simple and they say, well, okay, if it's a habit or repeated action, we use present simple, like I play football every Thursday. And I think the moment came when I just looked at a sentence like that and I thought, wait a minute, it's repeated because of the word every. That's not present simple, that's the word every. I play football doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell you the time you do it. It doesn't tell you how often you do it. It just tells you that it's true and it's not past. It doesn't tell you it's repeated or a habit. Every Thursday tells you that. So I started looking again at all these grammar treatments in the course books, and I thought, okay, I can understand why they do it. They've got 10 books to sell in a series. Of course, they need to chop up grammar into little pieces so that you've got something to put in each book. But the idea that this piece of grammar should go in your A2 book and this piece should go in your C1 book, that seemed a bit nonsensical because that's not the way that my kids speak English. My kids are bilingual, so they're kind of outside of the level dynamic a little bit anyway. Yeah. So the idea came to mind that I should take all of this, a lot of the stuff from Tilbury and from Lewis, and try and kind of synthesize something new that speaks of my own experience of looking at this. A fresh voice might work if something written in the 70s and 80s no longer works to claim its audience. And I was inspired a little bit by a famous footballing quote, which is another thing that I opened the book with, which is that I think it was Bill Shankly once said, football is a simple game. The problem is all these people making it more complicated. And you can kind of see this a little bit. Like there was a meme going around because of Man City against Real Madrid. And it was like the different sorts of systems, like Pep Guardiola at Manchester City. Every single player has their role. They have to do this. They have to run this many steps forward, occupy this form within if we've got possession, and this if we haven't. Carlo Ancelotti at Real Madrid is like, lads, do it for the team. And who won? Well, Real Madrid won. Now, that's not always going to be the case, and there is space in football for people like Pep Guardiola. But my goodness, do they not make it so complicated? Sometimes you just want your players to go out onto the pitch and try their best. And I thought, well, that could be the same for English or for any language, really. But English is the one I know best. So maybe English grammar is not really so complicated. Maybe there are certain truths at the heart of English grammar, and everything else comes from those things. So if you learn that heart of it, You don't need to learn the rest because it just kind of follows from first principles.
I see. And you explain those principles in your book, right? Because it's for students and for teachers as well.
That's right, yes. Yeah, I know that some of the teachers that I've worked with have used my approach to conditionals, which again is not wholly original, but I feel that it's a good synthesis of things that have come before. So I think that there is originality in there. Certainly, the idea of the difference between objective and subjective distance, which is a long conversation, and I recommend people just read the book instead of listening to me drone on about it. But I feel that that's something that I came up with, and I hadn't heard it from other people before. So hopefully, but maybe I just wasn't
Cool.
talking to the right people.
I'll put the link in the show notes as well. And you did a lot of work on YouTube with English exams.
Hmm.
Now, I wanted to ask you something. I wrote, let's see if I can find it quickly. I wrote a blog post a couple of months ago or a month ago. It's very short, and I wanted to
Hmm.
ask you. I wanted to read it out, and I wanted to ask you. I would like you to answer the question that I ask in this blog post, and I say this. So, if good quality writing takes time, if
Hmm.
writing is a process, if the first draft is almost always rubbish, and if the verbs to redraft and to edit exist, then why do language exams assess writing skills based on a single draft written in under 60 minutes?
Mm.
Controversial, but I don't know what you think about it.
There's quite a lot to unpack there, and I think that
Hmm.
the main thrust of your argument is certainly well placed. And I think it's the same with, for example, speaking tests where there might be some sort of role play element. So if you've got to role play doing X, but X is something that you as a person would never do, is it actually a good test of your speaking?
Hmm.
They have to test something, don't they? They have to find a way to get a sample set of your writing or your speaking or your reading skills. There are always going to be shortcomings in any test. However, I think where I would disagree here would be that because most examining bodies do a very good job of communicating their expectations and they limit the different genres that you might be required to write about, you
Hmm.
should be able, with preparation, to produce a good first draft. Yeah.
Hmm.
So, for example, um, at my school, we have to do mid-year reports and end-of-year reports for every student. Yeah. When my teachers, who are fresh from the CELTA, write the first mid-year reports they've ever written, those reports do need a lot of editing. It's only natural. They've not written these mid-year reports for their students before. They might not know what to say. They might labor over it. A lot of them come to me and complain, Chris, I spent all weekend doing it and now you want me to change everything. I'm like, yeah, because it's not good enough. It needs to be better. It needs to be tighter. It needs to tell people something. You can't keep couching things in these uncertain terms. You need to do this, this, and this better. Yeah. I don't have the same conversations with my second year teachers because in my second year, the teachers who have come to the school before and who have written mid year and end of year, and now they're writing mid year for the third time, they just sit down, they spend 2 or 3 minutes per student, like that, blitz it out, send it to me, and usually it's good enough. So a
Hmm.
student who goes into, for example, the C1 Advanced, and they've never written an essay before, you're right. They're not going to do a good job because they've never written an essay to Cambridge specifications before. But a student of mine who takes the C1 Advanced should already have written probably 10 proper essays by that stage. They'll have looked at the skills of essay writing, of planning, of organization, of good vocabulary choice. So, yes, they could still improve those essays by redrafting and by editing their work, but they should reach the exam with enough background in writing an essay that they can do a good job the first time.
Yeah, so they need to prepare. But I have a strong opinion here, which I'm not sure you will agree. Actually, I think you will not agree with me. But when you mentioned Cambridge specifications, like, to me, I did those exams. Okay, I did the first certificate, B2, C2, the IELTS. I did all of them, and I loved doing. I loved them because they helped me, and I say this in the book too. But now that I'm exploring this new art, which is writing, I feel that those exams, those preparation courses, they don't teach you writing. They don't teach you how to be a writer. They teach you how to use language in a way that meets specifications. And that is not writing, because writing, you can break the rules, you can get creative with it. It's not just, did you use linkers, did you use conjunctions, did you
I
this is
agree
my
and
main
disagree.
thing.
Yeah, I agree and disagree with you. And I'm going to ask you a question here, and I know the answer is going to be no, but have you ever seen the really early paintings by Pablo Picasso? Like the paintings he did in his 20s? Yeah?
No.
The paintings that Picasso produced in his 20s were all realistic. They were all classical studies, still lifes, landscapes, portraits, and they were done with an assured eye and an assured hand. And they are gorgeous to look at and quite forgettable because they look like any other competent and talented painter's pictures would have done from that period.
Okay.
But he did it first. He painted those pictures. So he can always say to people, don't talk to me about me just being useless and I'm just going like this. I know how to paint. And I painted pictures like this and it didn't satisfy me. And now I paint creatively. I had to kind of unlearn these things, but I had to go through those stages. You're not going to get a talented writer who didn't go through the stages of learning about coherence and cohesive devices and paragraphing. If you find a writer now, and Bolano is an example of this, yeah? There's a book of Bolano's, By Night in Chile, I think it was called. It's quite short. It's about 130 pages, but it's only 3 paragraphs long. And the last 2 paragraphs are on the last page. It's a pain of a book to read when you're on the train because you're like, oh, my stop's coming. I need to put the bookmark in at the end of this paragraph. Oh, there's no paragraphs. Yeah. But you have to learn to write with paragraphs before you can start to see why you might not write with paragraphs. You can't do it the other way around. You can't say, I'm going to break all the rules without first obeying them.
I see. Okay. Yeah, and I agree, because I learned how to write, not creatively, but how to write, also thanks to those exams. That's true. That's true. I did a lot of writing, and I always put this picture on some of my blog posts of all the writing that I did in preparation for those exams. Okay, yeah. My favorite quote of all time is, whatever brilliant idea you... Okay, now I don't even remember my favorite quote, but it goes something like this. It's something like this. Whatever brilliant idea you might hear or see, the opposite of that idea may also be true, is also likely to be true, by Derek Sivers. And it's the quote that I open my book with. So there is always another side, another angle that we can.
Well, this is the structure of any language you want. Is that what it's called?
Yeah, Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that structure. The idea that this is how you learn, but actually this is also how you learn, and they're polar opposites. And like I said at the start of this talk, a lot of the ideas that I've had from stories are basically this is the book that I've just read. This is the book that I didn't read, but I could have read if the writer had chosen differently. And because he didn't choose differently, he chose this. I can now do this. And that's one way in which you come up with ideas
Fantastic.
for stories. You just take the road not traveled.
Yeah, you fill the gaps. I love that. And okay, to conclude our uh, very interesting conversation, for me at least, um, recommendations for non-native English writers. What would
Hmm.
you what would you say to these guys?
Well, I'd say a couple
Like,
of things because I
mm,
have met students
mm,
who wanted to be writers. And
mm,
the anecdote that I told earlier about the person who wanted to be a writer when they found the right typewriter, yeah, I think that certainly comes to play here as well. Because I've met a lot of people who want to start writing, but they're waiting until they reach a certain level of proficiency. And I don't think that's
mm,
necessary. And I don't think it's a good idea. If you want to start writing in English, you ought to start now, regardless of your level. And it doesn't matter if you don't have perfect command of the language, because really we want a good idea for a story and a good character, and we want to see how those interrelate. You can always find an editor who will help you polish your work. But if you don't have any work to put in front of an editor, you'll never get anywhere. And the editor doesn't have to be professional. It could just be somebody who's a bit better at English. It could be your English teacher. It could be anybody. The idea is to get started and to get into it. But then do put your work out there. Find people to read it. So I've helped quite a few of my students over the years get their work out there. With one of my students, we got a piece published in a non-fiction journal called Hectoan International, which was it's called
mm-hmm,
where humanities meets medicine or something like that. We wrote a piece together about how some football players had their careers ended by Achilles injuries, but others managed to recover from it. And just basically talking about it. We did some research, we put the ideas together, we sent it off. And what was really useful was that when they said yes, but. And they sent back the editor's version with all of this red ink over it saying, change this, delete this. We spent 2 lessons just looking at the feedback we received. It's such a really good learning opportunity, and it makes writing any subsequent piece that much easier.
so publish your writing. This is something I
Yeah,
always, and now it's so easy to publish your writing. You can
yeah,
do it on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Medium, on your personal
you
blog.
can. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
So okay.
it helps if you publish through some avenue that has an editor that will intervene, because you don't want to put work
Mm,
out there that's clearly unpolished or requires correction, especially in terms of the language. Because if somebody starts reading and then they give up, they probably won't come back. So there is that one proviso. Don't start throwing your work out there until you feel that it's good enough for an editor, certainly, but with the general audience and going self-published, you have to be sure. Because I remember recently contacting a self-published independent author to ask why did they keep writing "it's" with an apostrophe, and they said, well,
mm.
because it's possessive. And I was like, but "it's" with as a possessive is without an apostrophe, and they're like, I don't know what you mean. Now this was an English person. It wasn't a student. It was an English person. And
Whoa.
they got very
Okay.
defensive about it. And they started saying, well, I don't have an editor. I don't have somebody to tell me these things. And I was like, okay, but maybe you could have checked before kind of sending. Like, it's a published thing now. It's out there. It's printed. People have got copies. And if they find mistakes like that, they might not come back to you. But if you've got a good story, don't wait until your English is perfect to start writing it, but make sure that somebody helps you to polish it before you put it out into the world.
Uh, my book was read by 5 people before I published it, and
Hmm.
most of them were native English speakers, and there are still typos there. There's
Oh
also a
yes.
word,
Yeah.
I used physician instead of physicist, I think, when I
Hmm.
talk about Einstein.
Yeah.
And this tells me, how many people should have read my book? Like, were they, how did
Well,
they not,
the right
like,
number is one. The right number is one
mm,
person, but it needs to have been the right person.
okay. Well, but they were trusted people, okay? I don't want to
Oh, I'm
have
sure
a
they
go on
were.
them
I'm
now.
sure they were.
Yeah.
No, no, I'm
Uh,
sure they were fantastic people to have done that for you. Um, but it depends if somebody is reading that book for the purpose of finding every single possible mistake, or if they're reading it to be able to say to you, "Hey, it's a good book. I enjoyed it. Thank you." I mean, those are two different people.
yeah, something to learn for my next book. Are you working on any books at the moment?
I put that on hold. I do have an idea for one, but I've put it on hold because I was sent a book just a few days ago to proofread. So I think all of
Oh,
my free time, my attention is going to be placed there. But I find it's very good practice because, when you pay close attention to other people's work and you go through looking for every mistake, you become a bit more sensitive to your own, I suppose.
yeah. It's
Plus, I
something
might
that
pick up some new ideas as well, which is always good.
yeah, it's something that another writer who I interviewed here on the podcast, on the YouTube channel. She's a professional writer. She writes for Lonely Planet, CNN, National Geographic. Um,
Wow.
that's what she said. Give feedback, like read other people's
Hmm.
work and give feedback,
Yeah.
because that will help you. Okay, Chris, thank you. Wow, this is one of the most interesting conversations I've had on my podcast, and
Oh, thank you.
I don't always say this. It's true, and very grateful. Where can people find your like? Where do you want to direct our watchers, listeners
I
to?
suppose the most logical place would be Amazon. If you do a search for Christopher
Mm,
Walker, or if you look for any of the books that I've mentioned, for example, The Four Queens, Hit the Bottom and Escape, Sarah the
yeah,
Writer, if you look
you'll
for
have to send
those,
me a list.
because there are a lot of other Christopher Walkers who have published books on Amazon, and if you see one that has like a really like ripped guy on the front with like six pack abs, that's not me. But I know that there is a book by Christopher Walker out there with that cover, so not me. I bear no responsibility for any six packs.
Okay, great. So Amazon. All right, everything will be in the show notes. Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Very
very much, Fabio.
insightful. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're back. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Chris. I just wanted to let you know that all the links are in the show notes, and soon I'm opening a group for non native English writers. Chris, at the end of the conversation, said, make sure that someone reads your writing before it goes out there into the world. Well, this is one of the reasons why I'm opening this group. It's a group where we write together, where we give feedback to each other. I'll be there too. There are meetings. I hope you will join the group if this interests you. The link is in the show notes. And thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye bye.